Hi, everybody. It's Brad Truex from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. We're coming up on Groundhog Day, so what better topic to talk about than groundhogs? There's the groundhog. Groundhogs are also known as woodchucks, and they actually often go by other names such as ground pigs or whistle pigs. And they're rodents. They're actually members of the squirrel family. In fact, they're the largest member of the squirrel family in North America. And a typical adult might be a little less than 2 feet in length with a 3 to 7 inch tail. And they typically weigh somewhere around 10 pounds. The females are a little bit smaller than the males. And groundhogs have thick fur that's various shades of brown. And there are actually two layers to the fur. They have a dense gray undercoat, and then they have a longer coat of banded guard hairs that actually guard the denser fur. And they also have very powerful short legs and broad, long claws that they use for digging. Groundhogs are burrowing animals, so the claws are especially important for them to be able to dig those burrows. And they're actually very good swimmers, and they can climb tall shrubs or even trees. Groundhogs have four large incisors. Again, you can see them. Almost looks like a beaver's teeth, uh, but they don't contain iron like the beaver's teeth do. So they tend to appear whiter. If you remember, we've said that the beaver's teeth often have a slightly orangish discoloration because of the iron content. But because the groundhogs don't have iron in their teeth tend to be a much purer white. And those teeth grow about a millimeter and a half each day. And that just about keeps up with how much they lose due to their teeth wearing down from eating. Actually, the incisors of all rodents never stop growing. That's an interesting fun fact. So, what do groundhogs eat? They're primarily herbivores. They eat grasses and other vegetation, berries, bark, leaves, agricultural crops. Some of their favorite foods are clover, alfalfa, and dandelions. But they occasionally eat things like grubs, grasshoppers, snails, bird eggs, and even baby birds. So technically, they're omnivores. A groundhog can eat up to a pound of vegetation at a time. And as we mentioned, their teeth get worn down from eating that much. And that's just enough to keep up with the growth of their teeth of about a millimeter and a half per week. And because they don't cache their food like squirrels do, they tend to eat very voraciously in order to store fat for the winter. And they can actually double their weight over the summer and fall in preparation for the winter. Groundhogs are mostly active during daytime, particularly in the morning and late in the afternoon. They also like to sun themselves, so you might see them laying out in the sun. And they usually stay pretty close to their burrows, and they may only be above ground for a couple hours each day. And they tend to prefer open spaces so that they can see any potential predators. And groundhogs, again, we mentioned, are burrowing animals. And their burrows can be up to 66 feet long, so incredible complex structures. And the burrows provide a place for them to sleep, to avoid bad weather, to raise their families, to hibernate, and be protected from predators. And their burrows are very elaborate structures that have multiple levels and multiple chambers. I'll show you a diagram of one in a minute. And they often have two homes, a summer home out in the meadow and a winter home in the woods. But their digging and their burrowing can be a nuisance for farmers or for gardens or for structures such as porches and sheds. This is a diagram of a typical groundhog burrow, very elaborate, can be up to 60 feet, 66 feet long and up to 6 feet deep. And again, in addition to a main entrance, which is over here, there are usually one or more plunge holes, which are secondary holes that they can use for escaping or entering. And these plunge holes or the secondary exits are often concealed by vegetation, or they may be even plugged up by either vegetation or some dirt in some cases. And there are multiple separate chambers, some for sleeping, some for nursing, some for waste disposal over here. And there may even be a separate chamber for the groundhog to turn around and go out the main exit. Uh, Again, we mentioned that groundhog burrows typically have at least two entrances and exits. They may actually have multiple entrances and exits. And you may see a hole in the ground, just like this one over at the right, often surrounded by mounds of dirt. And one or more of those entrances may be disguised by the dirt or by other vegetation. And if you're lucky enough, you might even see a groundhog peeking out of that hole. Typically, the holes are anywhere from 8 to 12 inches, again, just about the size of a groundhog. Groundhogs are usually solitary except when they're mating, and they breed in March or April, shortly after they emerge from their burrows in the winter. And they don't form lasting bonds, so typically the males usually don't associate with the females after brief mating. And one litter is produced each year, usually in April or May, and the average litter size is about 3 to 5 pups. The family usually breaks up by the end of August, and the pups go off on their own to make their own burrows. Groundhogs are true hibernators. In early June, their metabolism begins to slow, and while their food intake does decrease somewhat, their weight actually increases by as much as 100%. And that's so they can deposit fat in order to sustain them during hibernation in the late winter. So they can actually double their weight over the summer and the fall. And instead of storing food or caching food similar to squirrels, groundhogs really stuff themselves in order to survive the winter when they're not going to be eating. So groundhogs are true hibernators. In winter, their temperature drops from about 99 degrees down to 37 degrees. Their heartbeat slows from 80 beats per minute down to just about 5 beats per minute. Their breathing slows from 16 breaths a minute to as few as 2 breaths a minute. And though their metabolic rate slows, they'll lose 25 to 50% of their weight over the winter. So all the weight that they gained over the summer and the fall, they lose during the winter hibernation. And while they do typically emerge from hibernation around February 2nd, it's really only a myth that they can predict spring. Groundhog tracks, the hind paw is usually positioned in front of the front paw when they're walking. And again, they're four toes on the front paw, 5 on the hind paw. So again, remember, this is the hind paw up here. It's got 5 toes. This is the front paw. It's got 4 toes. And the prints are usually about 1.5 inches long. And there's usually about 4 inches between the paws when they're walking, maybe up to 12 inches when they're running. And the hind heel often doesn't touch the ground. So sometimes the hind paw will appear to be shorter than the front paw. And the claws are often visible. Okay, so here in the mud, you can clearly see the claws. Here in the snow, it's a little bit more difficult. Again, you can tell that the front paw here has 4 toes. The hind paw has 5 toes. Now, remember, this is a little unusual because we said when they walk, usually the hind paw is in front of the front paw. The claws are often visible, but particularly here in the snow, you can barely see them. You can just kind of make out a claw right over here. So groundhog scat, you're probably not going to see it. And that's usually because they poop underground in their burrows. Remember, we said that in the burrows, there's typically a chamber that's used for waste. And it's often said that if you can see scat in your yard, it's probably from another animal, not from the groundhog. And any scat that you would see would probably have vary in appearance based on what their diet looks like at the time. So other signs of groundhogs would be large mounds of dirt. Here you see a very large mound of dirt that's near an entrance to a burrow. And a typical groundhog hole is, again, about 8 to 10 inches in diameter. It's roughly circular, and you can picture a groundhog fitting right into that hole. You should always look for a second escape hole that's usually within about 20 to 25 feet. And again, there may actually be multiple escape holes. Groundhogs do have predators. Coyotes, black bears, badgers, fishers, bobcats, fox, coyotes, wolves, large hawks, eagles, owls. So again, a whole host of predators. And their extensive burrow system helps protect them from predators. But humans, dogs, and motor vehicles also can kill groundhogs. Groundhogs do get ailments. They typically only live 2 to 3 years, sometimes as long as 6 years in the wild. And they're prone to both parasitic and bacterial infections. They can also get rabies. Signs of rabies might include falling over, looking disoriented, or walking in circles. Some fun facts about groundhogs, though they tend to be solitary, when they meet another groundhog, they touch their nose to the mouth of the other groundhog, and it looks like they're actually kissing. And sometimes they're called whistle pigs, and that's because they make high-pitched whistling sound when they're startled. And sometimes they're called a mouse bear because they resemble a small bear when they're sitting upright. And sometimes they're called a land beaver because they actually look like beavers, except that beavers are aquatic animals and these are land animals. So, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? And the answer to that riddle, none, because woodchucks don't chuck wood. Yes, groundhogs can be nuisances, and they do provide some benefits, though. Their burrowing is actually very good for the soil. It tends to aerate the soil and provides oxygen for the soil, so it facilitates plant growth. And their abandoned dens are often used by other animals, like chipmunks, rabbits, and snakes. So, how do you get rid of a groundhog? We're often asked how to get rid of nuisance groundhogs. And again, they can eat a lot of vegetation in gardens, and their digging can be destructive to both farms and gardens. And it can even undermine some structures like a shed that you might have. The most effective way to keep them from getting to your garden is to install a simple 3 foot high fence around the plot. And that fence should extend at least a foot underground and be a bit wobbly so the groundhog can't climb on it. And there are deterrents that have been used, things like mylar strips, balloons, pinwheels, and products containing capsaicin. That's the chemical found in spicy peppers. Some others say that used kitty litter is especially likely to make them leave their dens. And loud music could also get them to move from under your porch. Cage-like traps can be used to capture and relocate them, but you need to know the regulations in your state and consider that relocation is not necessarily humane. And don't forget, if you do chase them off or relocate them, you need to close off all the entrances once they're gone. This is showing a cage-like groundhog trap that's placed over the entrance to the burrow, often with a tarp over it to kind of keep it dark and make it look almost like part of the burrow. And each day you can put a little bit of food bait in there, something like an apple or a carrot or a piece of lettuce, and move that back further each day. So eventually the groundhog will follow it in all the way to a point where a gate will drop down, trapping the groundhog. And again, relocating the groundhog is actually quite stressful for the animal, and many actually die shortly after relocating. And as a result, some states require that the groundhog has to be relocated within 100 yards of the original burrow. So again, Groundhog Day is coming up shortly. Every February 2nd of each year is Groundhog Day. And you've all seen pictures of Punxsutawney Phil coming out of his burrow on Groundhog Day. The myth is that if he emerges from his burrow on February 2nd and sees his shadow, he's going to retreat to his den, and winter's going to go on for 6 more weeks. On the other hand, if he doesn't see a shadow, spring is going to arrive early. And though there are many activities that animals do that actually can foretell weather, this one is clearly a myth. So that's a little bit about groundhogs. Hope you've enjoyed it, and come back again some other time.